No worries.
There we go. She gave me the voice notification that we are definitely recording this time. Hello, guys. My name is Greg Gibson. I'm with the United Patriot Party, and it is a pleasure to be here with you. We want to take the opportunity to meet as many grassroots candidates as we can to find out who they are, what they stand for, and as well to find out how we can get involved in their campaigns. They have got, they don't have the establishment backing. Most of these folks are running on their own steam. They are funding their campaign out of pocket. They're working every day, just like you and I. And what they need is not just our dollars, but they need our labor and our help. So we want to meet them, and we want to be able to get in touch with them. And we'll give you all that information, how to get in touch in a little bit. But for now, I would like to introduce Alex Stovall. Alex is running for Arizona's 4th District, and I'm going to let him have the opportunity to introduce himself. Mr. Stovall, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Alex Stovall. I'm running for Congress in CD4, which was previously CD9 against Greg Stanton. Me and my brother live together. We work full time. I have 2 dogs. One dog is my service dog, and I'm an Arizonan. I'm a grassroots candidate. I go to work, as you mentioned, just like everybody else does, typically 5 a.m. until 5 or 7 p.m. in the evening. So it's a grind. It really is. But I think if being conduit to something greater and giving children, our children, my future children, an opportunity to be able to do what I'm doing at the capacity, then so be it. So it's definitely a blessing.
Fantastic. Mr. Stovall, we talked a little bit before we got started with this interview that you are running against, oh my goodness, Greg Stanton.
Yeah.
Mr. Stanton has been in office for an untold amount of time, correct?
Yes, he was mayor for 6 years. He was a horrible mayor, so he managed to slither his way into Congress.
There we go. And we, as the United Patriot Party, want to make sure that we're actually finding real and legitimate people. So along that line, what would you say would be your number one priority when entering into office?
Well, I would say that's a double-edged sword. First and foremost, securing the border, because without securing the border, everything else is in vain. If you have everybody coming through the borders, you're going to have drugs coming through the borders. You've got sex trafficking coming through the borders. It's just not realistic not to secure the borders and then do everything else. Secondly, to the other point of that sword, I would say education. Knowledge is power, and people in our communities are lacking knowledge and education because our elected officials, majority of them are asleep at the wheel. And unfortunately, our children are the ones suffering.
Very cool. Very cool. And your background, you grew up with a silver spoon in your mouth, just handed everything to you. Is that correct?
No, not quite. I actually grew up in the democratic system, the EBT, the food stamps. I'm not really sure what they call it, low income housing. I've lived in 57 different locations in my state. I'm very, very familiar with my state. I know places by zip codes, not by city, because I've moved so much. So I have a very unique perspective. So I don't come from a very establishment-like background, if you will. I come from a very dysfunctional, relatable background. When I'm signing policy and passing legislation in DC to secure the border and take care of conservative constitutional values, my perspective is authentic. It's real. I'm living the life that other Americans are living every day. I have a pulse on the community because I'm in the community every day.
And with that being said, what got you into the desire to run for office? What brought you to that point?
You know, I would say there's a million things that got me to that point. And it seems like every time somebody asks me this question, another reason comes, because you got Brandon in office carrying on like he is. And then you have people that say there's something and not really following or adhering to what it means to be a Republican or a conservative. So I would say the most recent thing would be with the military. We've got soldiers, men and women. I'm currently serving in the reserves as a minister in the Army and doing memorandums and overseeing memorandums and exactly the impact taking somebody's medical freedom away entails. And there's so many different avenues that I could go down with dealing with this, but we are really not in a good place. My brothers, my sisters, my friends that have died in the military that fought for all of our freedoms, freedom, liberty, and justice in its entirety, are at stake at losing their own freedoms. So it's concerning, it's disheartening. And that's another thing that kind of fuels my fire to run for office the way that I am, grassroots specifically.
Very cool. Well, just to give you and our listeners, our viewers, some idea of what the United Patriot Party stands for, we have sort of this basic list as far as things that need to be taken care of. We've asked for a long, long time about tax reform. And so we put that at the very top of our list. Number one, we've asked for a very long time now about border security. Nothing ever gets done. So we put that at the top of our list, number one priority. We've asked for, like you said, the education reform, number one priority. We've asked for term limits. So we put that as a number one priority. We see that working people are being burdened unnecessarily. We're paying somewhere in the neighborhood of 35% more taxes now than the day that they pushed the tea into the harbor in Boston. So let's cover just a few things from here, just asking you kind of your position on these things. What's your position on constitutional adherence?
I think that should be the foundation of anybody that's interested in getting to office. Our forefathers were, pretty smart guys. They didn't write the Constitution to be interpreted any other way than how it was written, in my opinion. Most people would say it's an archaic document, but I would say our forefathers were very spiritual, very biblical, and they were wise beyond their years. Because it's amazing to see just how our Constitution can still be implemented today. So that would be my response to that question.
Absolutely. All right. We touched on it very briefly, but one of the very top of our list on agenda items is an election or election security and overhaul. How would you go about if you had if you could just wave a magic wand? What would you see as needing to be done first in our election system?
I would have precinct committee men and women that would count the ballots. I would get rid of Dominion machines. You can't trust them. They can't be trusted.
Absolutely.
And anybody can manipulate it. And I think there are plenty of precinct committee men and women that would be willing to volunteer their time to ensure that our elections are fair, free, and integrity based.
Absolutely.
So it would take a little bit more time, but there are ways that we can make that happen.
And what is your notion on, or how do you feel about mail-in ballots?
We have mail-in ballots in Arizona. Our system in Arizona is not like any other state. We've never had an issue with it. I do think that it should be state-based, based on the local legislation. And that's just my opinion for what I've seen. Florida's different than Arizona. Cali's different than Arizona. We haven't had a lot of the voter fraud that other states have had. We've had voter fraud, but it hasn't been as significant as other states. So I think it should be a state-by-state basis. And I think the American people that are in those states know better than anybody. And I wouldn't leave it to some general overarching umbrella to kind of dictate how elections in those states should be conducted. It needs to go back to the people. And the only way you do that is getting precinct committee men and women involved. So that's how I would solve that. All my answers are going to come right back to the people. The people have got to be accountable. The people have got to get involved. And if the people aren't accountable and they're not involved, this train isn't going to move.
Absolutely.
And we've seen that in the last 50 years.
A lot of people on the left really thought that, this was all about Donald Trump. I think for most of us, it was more about can we actually trust the election? Because at the end of the day, sometimes you just lose. I mean, you lose ball games, you lose, elections. You regroup, you come back stronger the next time. The problem is if you can't trust it, if you think that it's rigged, then, how do you regroup from that? So I want to see us hopefully develop those items that you've talked about and move to a system that we can actually count on and depend on and trust. We were supposed to have flying cars by this point, and we can't even cast ballots. Facebook can take a poll tomorrow, and in a few hours' time, they can have millions, if not billions, of votes counted. And you're telling me that the strongest superpower the world has ever known can't develop a trustworthy election system? That just seems ridiculous to me.
Well, I would say success stories don't make money.
Well, that's a good point. That's a very good point.
It'd be too easy to fix that. So I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. You've got to get the local people involved, and you've got to get grassroots candidates in there, because as long as there's establishment people that have been there 10, 12, 15 years that aren't signing term limit pledges, we're going to have the same issue. I mean, we've got no young people in office. That's a serious problem. We've got to be mentoring the next generation. TikTok and book facing and chat snapping and all that other stuff, it's distracting the kids. We've got to start getting them reeled into what's going on.
We've managed to move all attention spans to somewhere between 15 seconds and 3 minutes. So right. It's pretty amazing. Well, while we're on the subject here of term limits, I don't know if you've ever looked through Ted Cruz's proposal. Now I've got some opinions on that, but we'll save those for another day. But how do you feel about and how would you implement a term limit proposal?
I don't think it needs to be more complex than this. I'm going to be in for 3 terms. If I'm not running for Senate, I'm not running for governor or president, then I move out. Simple as that. We don't need to make it legally complicated. That's the problem with the criminal justice system now. We create all these rules and regulations and all this red tape and all these tricky, confusing words that the average person doesn't know how to read or interpret. And it's this funnel of just nonsense. 1 piece of paper, you sign it. 3 terms, you elevate or you get out. Either you move into a better position or something that's gradual that you can continue to mentor and impact people, or you get out. It's as simple as that. There's no reason to have career politicians. You can make a career out of it if you'd like, but if you're not gradually moving up and you're just going to be Congress for 20 years or Senate for 20 years, that's a no-go. So I think his policy should be a little bit more simplistic, because everybody needs to be able to understand what's going on. And right now it's very complex. The average person doesn't understand all the legislation. They use all these fancy words and all this nonsense. So that's my opinion. I think we could solve a lot of the issues by that.
Just buried in legalities at a bare minimum. And, with the Biden administration right now, we're looking at a 42-year career politician. We're looking at the results of that, to where he was the best and the brightest that the Democrat Party had to offer. I'm going to go off on a little tangent here. At 360 million people in the country, let's go to just 300, round it down to 300 million, and let's say there's 150 million people voting Republican and 150 million voting Democrat. We know that the numbers are nowhere near that high. So let's round it all the way down to somewhere in the neighborhood of the numbers that we saw the last time. 80 million on one side, 80 million on the other side. Out of 80 million people, we couldn't find anybody with better cognitive and reasoning abilities than Joe Biden. A senior citizen who really needs to be taken to a home. I'm shocked by that. So the term limits are something that I personally think are essential, and the up or out I honestly, I've just never really looked at it in that perspective, but I like that because at each point where you move up, you would be able to mentor somebody who's just coming in. I like that idea. That's really phenomenal.
Politics are supposed to be, our forefathers were farmers. They did their time. Oh, shoot, there's a pothole in the street. Somebody should fix this. They run for office, they fix the pothole, and they go back to farming potatoes. They didn't sit there for 10, 20 years passing not passing, sponsoring legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Sponsoring is a fancy way to say you're not doing your job as far as I'm concerned. You don't get to sponsor projects at work. No, you get fired. You either do it or you get fired, So that's just my opinion. I feel like politics has been too complex.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Now, something else that I see as being absolutely essential to us is an overhaul of the tax system. And we'll get into that just a little bit if you'd like. We're burdened to a point where working people, and we're not even talking inflation at this point. We're just talking about the tax code where people are taxed at every turn of their life. Products that they buy
Right.
and products that they've already bought and paid for. How would you restructure our tax code if given the chance? And do you see that as a priority?
I personally think we should get rid of taxes, in my opinion. They were supposed to be temporary, now they're long-term. But obviously there's 545 elected officials. That's never going to happen. So what I would do is I would amend it or reform the bill in a way by first and foremost lowering the cost of living. You can't raise the cost of living, inflate a dollar, and then also raise a person's taxes. They're being squeezed on both ends. They know it and we know it. The problem is they don't care about those issues. So I think lowering the cost of living is a step in the right direction. That would be the first thing I would say. Anything that's tax related, lower taxes is what people want. But I think what people really want is to be able to live off of one household income and live comfortably. We can do that. You just lower the cost of living and everything else will come down and it will follow. It's a domino effect. Politics is very simple. And I think those that are currently elected, a vast majority of them seem to think that Americans are silly. I come from the projects and even I could figure this out. It's not rocket science. You don't keep raising the value of the dollar or inflating the dollar. You lower the cost of living and naturally the dollar will come and correct itself naturally. This is just speaking on, taxes or stocks, fundamental level of markets. But the dollar is currently, $100 now is probably worth close to $92.50. That's concerning. It's very concerning. And I know you probably heard about the CPI where we're at 7.5%. These things could be alleviated and eliminated if they were just doing what they're supposed to be doing. They should actively be working to lower the cost of living for Americans. This inflation is going to consume America, and our kids will be paying this if we don't make the corrections now.
Absolutely agree. That I heard a report the other day that with the CPI at 7.5% now, if you adjust it to the same metrics used in the 80s, late 70s and early 80s, it's actually closer to 15%, which is historical numbers. A little bit of accounting and you can get it down to 7.5. But I believe people all over the nation right now are finally really feeling the crunch. Everybody's been fighting for the elevation in minimum wage, the federal minimum wage. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much you make if the price exceeds what you can afford. And more people, I believe, are starting to see that because they're not just seeing it on, big ticket items, cars, homes, things like that. They're actually seeing it in the grocery store. And they're seeing it in, in pretty much every aspect of their life.
Right.
So I believe that we actually have every consumer across the country at this point on the consumer side saying, wait a minute, something is horribly wrong. For those of us in the working world, we watch 60% of our paycheck leave our pocket and go into the hands of politicians who declare that they can spend it better than we can. I don't think any of us are really against taxes. I mean, I like potholes being filled. I like good roads.
Right.
But I'm against overtaxation. Being taxed to the point that if there's an excess of money that can be given overseas, then I was taxed too much. That's just the basics of how I look at it. So I don't think, any of us are saying that we don't want to, we're not willing to contribute to society. But we are saying that, there is a difference between contribution and just this forced theft. And that's what it is. It's theft.
Right.
I would love to see us go to a sales tax.
I totally.
Go ahead.
Speaking candidly, if taxes weren't a realistic thing nowadays, to fix potholes and roads, then I would get rid of it. But I completely understand where you're coming from. This is just me talking to you from my personal perspective and what I've experienced. So
absolutely.
One thing I do believe in. Go ahead.
Well, I'm with you. I believe, taxation is theft. At one time in history, we contributed to the mental health of people in our communities through our local churches. We contributed to a lot of the local issues through church. Well, the government's done a really grand job of separating people from church. They by saying that, well, you got to separate church, church and state, they've managed to actually separate people from church. So that outlet does not get used. And really it can't, because, excuse me, people are, they're drained before their paycheck ever comes to their hand. So there's better ways to contribute back to our society than paying it all up to an entity, the entity of the government through the strong arm of the IRS. So I would love to see us go to more of a sales tax based tax system, and as well as, once that money's freed up, encourage people to spend that money in their communities. Again,
good one. Sales based. Let me write that down.
You can check into the fair tax or the flat tax program. Those are programs that came up and about in the 80s, and they were shot down pretty quick because it puts the entire tax system back into the control of the tax system back into the hand of the consumer. Whereas if you want to buy a new car, you pay taxes. If you want to buy a used car, you pay either little or no taxes. A lot of basic necessities are untaxed altogether. Groceries, clothing, things that you have to have, those are untaxed altogether. There's better programs out there, and those programs have always been gunned down because they aren't a constant. The government can't say, well, we can spend into the next 20 years based on what people may or may not purchase. So that's one of the reasons that they don't love it. Otherwise, it would be a matter of, if this year you wanted to save money, you buy less stuff. You keep the money you earn, so you buy less stuff, you keep more money. It puts the power back into the hands of the people. It's something to check into. Let's move forward just a little bit. What do you see? Now, I know you're focused on primarily Arizona, and as well you should be. I'm in North Carolina. We're trying to do everything we can for North Carolina. Integrity in the election system is something that's important to us. Not sure if you're aware, but we voted Trump, and then a Democrat governor, and then a Republican lieutenant governor. I don't see it. I don't think that's what actually happened. So for North Carolina, election integrity is something that we need to focus on here. But with that being said, what do you see as one of or some of the biggest threats to the United States as a whole? Something that every state is having to deal with.
I would say the Dominion machines. At some point, we've got to get patriots, PC committee men and women that are willing to volunteer their time. I mean, if they'll volunteer their time to knock doors for the candidate of their choosing, I have no reservations, assuming that they would come in to make sure the ballots were being counted and that they were conducting integrity-based principles in those practices. So I think getting the precinct committee men more involved at that capacity would be huge. And it does also empower the people. It gives them a sense of ownership and responsibility. I think it's a phenomenal idea.
As do I. How do you feel about what we're seeing going on in Russia right now, as far as our foreign affairs?
Well, you're talking to a veteran, so I think there's a lot of things that they could do differently. I think that if Trump were in office, this wouldn't be happening. I'm inclined to believe that Russia probably won't try and attack Ukraine because of the NATO treaty and things of that nature. But once again, it goes back to what I mentioned. If Trump was in office, China and Russia and Korea weren't going to poke the bear because they knew that Trump meant business. But in my personal opinion, I think the current president administration has shown weakness, and China and Russia are testing the water. We're not ready for another war. And I don't think men and women are willing to send their children to a suicide mission. So I think we've got to get some real sharp people in office with perspective to start legislating over federal foreign policy, because there's no reason we should even be having conversations about Russia going to take over Ukraine.
I agree.
So that's my simple opinion on that. And we've got to get a president and a leader in there that had a lot of Trump's characteristics and personality. He ran America the way America was supposed to be ran, and he was good at it. I think he's a great example of what our next president should look like.
Very cool.
Assuming he doesn't run.
How do you feel about the situation up in Canada right now, as far as the convoy and all that?
I think it's a peaceful protest, but Trudeau, whatever his name is, I don't really care, because he's trying to rain on their parade. If BLM can burn down buildings and hurt people, what's the issue with a bunch of truckers parking to protest, basically saying, you're going to destroy my livelihood because I don't want to get a shot? To me, it's just nonsensical. It doesn't make sense. It's about taking more control from the people. And I'm excited to see that the Canadian truckers have took a stance. Oh, you're going to fire me? That's cool. You'd fire me anyways if I didn't get the shot. So what difference does it make?
Sure.
People are tired. People are tired.
Well, that's
it's only a matter
of the things
of
now. I'm sorry, go ahead.
As it's only a matter of time before Americans start doing stuff like that.
Well, one of the things that we're trying hard to get people to understand now is that, you've already had the power to say no to the mask. You already had the power to say no to the vaccine. So exercise more than that. We've got to start thinking bigger than we've ever thought before. We've got to start, thinking in directions that we've never thought before. We preach radical liberty. We're all described and defined as domestic terrorists at this point, you included, just because of thinking the government's not doing a grand job. So if we're going to be a domestic terrorist, let's be a good one at least. Point being in that, it's not about violence. It's about thinking bigger. An expectation, if not a demand, of our representatives to do the job that we've sent them to do. And I think that's kind of where the Canadians are right now. I think that's where Americans are heading in the future, hopefully sooner rather than later, that we don't just go and say, well, okay, we don't want the mask mandates anymore, and give the government the opportunity to say, okay, no more masks, and we just go home. we can't stop there. We have to say, no, there is a tremendous amount of work that should have been done 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and you guys have shirked all that responsibility. So now we're holding you to a higher standard. As employers of those employees, we want to make sure that they understand that there are defined goals and expectations for them. I myself as an employee and the guys that work for me, if I don't give them clear and defined goals, everybody's just kind of aimless. So perhaps, our current state of affairs in politics, in American politics anyway, is really the people's fault. We have not sent politicians in with an expectation to do more, to do work. And along that line, I want to ask you this, as sort of a two-part question. Are you willing to work, quote unquote, across the aisle with Democrats? And the second part of that question is, do you feel that the party as a whole or individuals in the party can be trusted?
So the answer to your first question, Democrat or Republican, at the end of the day, we're all Americans. And there was a time, I believe, our forefathers, regardless of what side of the aisle they stood on, they came together and made decisions for the greater good of the country. So I do believe that it's possible. But you've got to drop this egotistical radical left or radical right agenda to push your narrative that's only going to benefit you. It's not about you, it's about the people. And if it doesn't benefit your people that you've been appointed to legislate over, then you shouldn't be doing it. It's as simple as that. And the other part to your question, it was what now?
Do you believe that the Republican or the Democrat Party as a whole, or in just individuals in it, can they be trusted because of the radical agenda that's sort of been encompassed within the Democrat Party lately?
I think there are Democrats as well as Republicans that went in with good intentions, just bad follow through. And because of that, it's going to take some time to earn that trust back from a conservative or back from a blue dog, if you'd say. So they've got to start passing legislation and policy that's appeasing the people. It's what the people want. That's why you get elected. You are a public servant, regardless of what side of the political aisle you stand on. And I think if we get back to that basis and that foundation, we're in the right direction as a country.
I agree. My dad, when he loved to hate politicians. He would watch C-SPAN, and I don't know if you've ever watched any C-SPAN, but when the camera is just on the floor and they're not in session, they're just kind of walking around doing daily stuff. He would watch it then. He would watch that camera just to see who would talk to who. And he would constantly point them out and say, oh, look, they're talking to that one. They're talking to that one. And his viewpoint was that, all politicians had to be corrupt to ever get into office. Now, I disagree with him. And like you, I believe that a lot of people go into politics with aspirations of doing better. Once they get in, they get bogged down. And something that we've never seen before, and I hope that by 24, we actually see it. I want to see not only you go into office, but between this year and the following election term, that we send enough grassroots people that you've got the support needed to make these changes. Again, it comes back to the people. When I was talking earlier about the establishment, in my old view, I would say, well, I'm going to always vote for the best candidate, and that candidate is always going to be a Republican. And honestly, now I would vote for a gravel on the side of the road before I would vote for another establishment candidate. And I say that because we keep putting these guys in office because they have an R by their name. And if you keep doing the same thing, you keep getting the same results. And I think we've started figuring that out, not as Republicans, but as patriots. I believe that the patriot movement in America has started understanding that if we don't put working class people back in office, we're never going to see policy that represents working class people. So we hope, my greatest hope is to not just get you into office, but to get so many just like you into office that you guys can affect change in American politics. Now you've mentioned a few times the founding fathers. Who would you say is a founder, or let me rephrase that? Who is an American historical figure that you consider a hero, that you look up to?
Sounds cliche, but I'd say Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah. And why is that?
His style of leadership was very empathetic, very powerful, and not aggressive. He was able to articulate and communicate with people, even if they had opposing views. And he never resorted to attack their character, to demean them. He would have a discussion with them. And I think that's what made him so powerful. He was able to have discussions and communicate with the opposite side and explain the rationale of why he thought and felt the way he felt.
I agree with you on
So,
that. Judge a man not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character should be the mantra of every human being on earth. And it definitely should be as an American, because we truly are a melting pot of culture and race and ethnicity and religion. We are surrounded by really good people and really rich cultures. If we would just learn how to talk to one another for once. And looking at his time in office, and when would you say that the wheel sort of started coming off of American government? When did it start failing the people?
I would say right around the Lyndon B. Johnson era, right around that time.
I agree.
People became objects and not people. People became numbers and votes and not people. People of color became just that group of people we need to vote to pass our radical agenda. And I think probably the last 50 years it's just kind of snowballed from there. But
Once you
that's my
start looking
perspective.
looking at people as a demographic rather than a person, it's
Right.
that's a downward slide.
Right.
Alex, I really appreciate you interviewing with me tonight and giving me the chance to get to know you and giving other people the chance to get to know who you are. You sound to me like a solid, independent thinking, rational individual, and I really appreciate you. So if you would let us know how can we get in touch with you? What are our connection points, and what are the things that you need from the people in Arizona to help you get into office?
Yeah, of course. So Alex for Arizona is my Twitter handle and my Instagram. I try and keep it simple for everybody. And my website is www.alexfor, not the number, arizona.com. And I would just say volunteers. I don't want to just get elected. I want to create a movement. Like I said, we've got to start mentoring the next generation. So I would say volunteers that are willing to help us with this community garden that we're building. It's 3 acres. Regardless of what side of the aisle you stand on, everybody's got to eat.
There you go.
And I think that's how we start it. That's how we build it, because everybody's got to eat. So I'd say volunteers for that. Donate to the campaign if you can, $2,900 or whatever you feel comfortable donating. But right now we've got to fund this machine from grassroots people, and only God and the people are going to get the glory from this. I mean, the movement we've created is so much bigger than me. I hope that when I'm elected and out of office, people don't remember my time in office as Alex was so great. I want them to remember as, yeah, he was a people person and all these people did X, Y, and Z because of him. I don't want to be on a platform. I want my legacy to be known as inspiring and empowering people to do the things that I had passion and strive to do. So that's what my goal is. That's where my heart is.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I love that. That is a beautiful answer. Guys, find him and get with him in any way that you can. The only way that we make the change, that we keep saying, well, we're patriots. The only way that we get that point across now is to get involved, to get busy, to get off the couch, turn the foosball game off, turn it all off, and get in action, get in gear. Because I went through a big chunk of my life personally thinking that politics was over there and it did not affect me. But the reality is the decisions that these people make on a daily basis affect me directly. And they don't just affect me, they affect my children, my grandchildren. They're going to affect my great and great great grandchildren. And if we don't start now, if we are not the change today, I'm afraid that this communist, socialist, liberal agenda is taking far too great a hold. And the only way that we change that is to put people like Alex Stovall in office immediately, and not just him, but we send so many more to back him up and to support one another and to really affect change across this country. We can do it. But this is guerrilla warfare. This is every one of us being involved. This is every one of us being part of it. And I love the notion that when all this dust settles, that, I'm going to have a hand in this, a part in this. It's going to be so minuscule, it will never be jotted down in history. But at the end of the day, I will know that I did my part to secure freedom through generations to come. So with that being said, Mr. Stovall, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you. I appreciate you forgiving my electronic inept nature. And I thank you very much for being with us. And I'll get all your links put in with the description of this video so people can contact you. And Mr. Stovall, thank you very much. God bless you and God bless our nation.
All right. God bless you and God bless America. Thank you, Greg.
Yes,
Bye
sir.
now.